won the highest literary prize in Canada at his time for his poetry. And his poetry is very inventive linguistically. It synthesizes the languages he heard in Montreal, so French, English, Yiddish, and he makes a kind of new language out of it, a bit like James Joyce does in his writing in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Klein also wrote a very important novel called The Second Scroll, which again is a bit like Ulysses in its construction and involves the search by a Jewish man from Montreal for his ancestors all over the world, through Russia, Ukraine, to Palestine. But again, it's considered a very important Canadian novel. But when Klein came to Winnipeg, and he came often, it wasn't as a writer necessarily. He was known as the editor of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, which was the leading Canadian English language newspaper in Montreal. And he was known because he came on behalf of labor Zionist organizations. He was known as a social democratic candidate for elections. And he was known for his work among Jewish refugees who had come to Canada after the Holocaust and before the Holocaust in the 1930s. So it's all a bit paradoxical, and I'll explain why as we go through this. But first, as I said, I want to show you a bit of the city that Klein was coming to. So Winnipeg was founded in 1874, right? So about 125 years ago, a little more than that. But it wasn't the first settlement where it was founded. Winnipeg is at the junction of two rivers, the Red River and the Assiniboine River, which Indigenous people regard as the heart of the continent. And geographically, it almost is. If you were to look at a map of North America, Winnipeg is almost in the very center. You think of Canada as a northern country, so it's strange to think of Winnipeg as the center of the continent, but there's all that space above it, right, which goes to the North Pole. And for Indigenous peoples, it was a major trading point and a major point of encounter. The first Europeans to settle at the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine were French Canadians. And they came as part of the fur trade. And many of them settled at the Red River and married Indigenous women. And a new people came out of that called the Métis. Right? In Spanish, sometimes you talk about mestizaje and mestizos. But in Canada, this population was a mixture of French and eventually Scots and Indigenous women. And so the Red River colony had its own economy. The major language, in addition to the Indigenous languages, was French, right? And the major religion was Roman Catholicism. When Canada became a nation in 1867, the business elite of Canada settled mostly in Ontario and in Montreal. The English elite decided it was time to move westward. And basically they bought back most of the land of the Canadian Northwest from the Hudson Bay Company. If any of you have been to Canada, the big department store is called the Bay. The Hudson Bay Company goes back to 1670 and a charter that it received from the King of England, which gave it control over all this territory. The Hudson Bay Company ceded its control to the Canadian government, who then sent out surveyors to divide up the land for settlers. So the idea was to make the prairies into an agricultural settler colonial location. The people at Red River organized against this. Their life was centered on the buffalo hunt, on trade, up and down the Red River into what is now the United States. And the province of Manitoba was born out of their insistence that their rights be guaranteed. So when the province of Manitoba became part of Canada in 1870, it came into Canada as a bilingual province, French and English, right, with rights of Native and Métis people preserved. But all of that disappeared very quickly within 15 years. as the Métis were aggressively pushed westward and massive waves of immigration arrived from Eastern Europe. So I talked the other day about the campaigns of colonization that the railways undertook in Eastern Europe to attract settlers. So the relationship between settlers and indigenous people is something that has become of great interest recently. For years in Canada's colonial history, there was no talk of this, right? It's as if the land had been unoccupied before Europeans arrived. But in fact, we know now that it was thanks to indigenous people that Europeans survived. Because as the trains stopped in the middle of winter, in the middle of nowhere, and dropped off Ukrainians and Jews, many of them would not have survived the winter without learning from indigenous people how to build a shelter. And I had the opportunity when I was a student many years ago, I interviewed some old Ukrainian settlers. They were women who were in their 90s when I interviewed them. And so they had come over very early. This was in the 1970s, right? And they would tell me stories about what it was like for them to be thrown off these trains in the middle of winter and learning how to dig a shelter in the snow. And it was indigenous people. Lately, there's a very beautiful book of poetry called Prairie Kaddish by a woman who goes to a cemetery in the Prairie province of Saskatchewan, a Jewish cemetery, and notices that the graves are above ground, which is very unusual for Jews, and have roofs, right? And this is because, of course, the ground is too hard to dig in the winter, and Jewish burial, as you know, must be rapid. And again, they learned from the local indigenous people how to build these graves. And so there were many interactions that have become silenced or forgotten. The other thing is that there were Jewish farming colonies all through the prairie provinces. Many in Saskatchewan, what is today Saskatchewan. I don't know if you have any map of Canada in your head. And some in Manitoba, near Winnipeg, but most of the ones in Manitoba didn't survive more than a generation. You can visit one that's not a real museum, but you can see traces of the Bender colony that still exists. But most Jews who went to agricultural settlements moved into the city within one generation. And that's where we start. So Winnipeg is not the French settlement at the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine. That was Saint-Boniface, right? But Winnipeg, that was on the east side of the Red River. On the west side was a trading fort called Fort Garry, where indigenous would come to trade their furs. And it was on the west side of the Red River that the Canadians, the English, established Winnipeg in 1874. So this is Winnipeg in 1874, more or less. Not much to look at, right? A kind of frontier town, right? But things changed very quickly. This is only about 20 years later, right? This is not a huge time later. This is the same location that I just showed you, right? And then another 10 years later, this is what you get, right? So this is quite amazing, right? So Winnipeg was the fastest, if not the fastest, one of the fastest growing cities in North America at the turn of the 20th century. Why? It had the same economic function in Canada that Chicago had in the United States. The center of the continent, a railway hub for transporting grain and transporting people and livestock, right? So all of these things made it a major industrial center and a boom town in the 1900s and 1910s, right? And its population went from 10,000 to 20,000 to 200,000 very, very, very quickly. So all kinds of people saw opportunity in coming to Winnipeg. My grandmother, one of my grandmothers, came from Galicia, near Krakow, to New York City, and had the classic story, working on the Lower East Side, in a garment industry. But her brother realized that there was opportunity in Winnipeg, and off they went to Winnipeg from New York because it was a boom town, right? So again, just these buildings are all built in the first 2 decades of the 20th. So what we would call a skyscraper, right, was already in Winnipeg built. This building was there at the time of the 1919 general strike, which I'll talk about in a minute. So again, I'm trying to give you an idea of the vitality of this community. This is Portage Avenue. The 2 major streets in Winnipeg are Main Street, which I just showed you, and Portage Avenue, not Portage, but Portage Avenue, which heads westward. So that's Portage Avenue, and that's Portage Avenue, about 20 years later. And the big department store, this big building on the right, is Eaton's. I told you, I think, about Eaton's the other day, where the curtains of on the display windows would be drawn on Sundays, because Christians should be focusing on the Lord and not on dresses, right, on Sunday. And I talked about the rail yards, which are enormous. In most cities have bridges to cross water, but Winnipeg has long bridges to cross rail yards, right, between neighborhoods. And one of the more curious things here is this bridge. This bridge was originally designed and built to cross the Nile River in Egypt. But for various reasons, it never made it there and got used instead to cross the rail yards in Winnipeg. So this, on this side, is the north end of Winnipeg. And the north end of Winnipeg is the part of the city where immigrant communities moved and lived, whether they be Jewish or Ukrainian or Polish. This was their side of the city. This was toward the center, and over on that end was the south end, which was where the wealthy lived, including wealthy Jews, right, a minority of the population. Immigrants arrived in Winnipeg to 2 very grand railway stations, the Canadian Pacific Station and the Grand Trunk Station, Union Station. I put this here because the architects of this station were the same as the ones who did Grand Central Station in New York City. Again, just to give you an idea of the ambitions of the city. It's still there, it's still used, it's a very beautiful building, right? What's interesting now is that all of this land behind, which at the time was rail yards, is now a historic park called the Forks, with museums about the history of the region, and this is where the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is also located. So here we are in the foreign quarters of Winnipeg in 1909. I don't know, it could be a shtetl in Europe as far as I can see, right? This is a typical residential street among working class immigrants to Winnipeg at the beginning of the 20th century. And are they Ukrainian? Are they Polish? Are they Jewish? I don't really know, but this is a typical scene that you would, Now, as in Montreal, when immigrants came, they would establish synagogues according to their place of origin. There was a large Romanian immigration to Winnipeg, and so there were several, in fact, Romanian synagogues, but also from Galicia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, of course. So this is still there. It's abandoned, right? It's the Rosh Pinah synagogue. Like all of the other synagogues at the time, it was Orthodox in practice, but like some others, it eventually moved toward conservatism. Conservatism meaning that men and women could sit together. Eventually, women could be rabbis or cantors, read from the Torah. Hebrew was still used for prayer, but more English was introduced into other parts of the service. And this moved with the general social and upward mobility of the congregation. Another one was the Sharon Zedek synagogue, again still there, although not used as a synagogue. And in education, the same thing. There was a range of educational opportunities for Jewish children. The first Volksschule Now, the first Yiddish folk school in North America was established in Winnipeg. Not in New York, not in Montreal, but in Winnipeg. It was the I.L. Parrots Folkschule. And it was Bundist in its orientation. So education was in Yiddish. Even my friends who went to the Parrot Schule as children in the 1960s called their teachers chaver, right? Comrade, right? Not Mr. or Mrs.
This wasn't like a Sunday school, it was...
No, this is day school.
Day school.
This is day school, so it would be half day Yiddish and half day the English curriculum of the province of Manitoba. I went to a Talmud Torah. The Talmud Torah was Hebrew education, right? And so in a Hebrew school, it would be half day Hebrew and half day English. And so this was the Winnipeg Free School, which was communist in its orientation, right? So you had, if you could send your child to a communist school, a Bundist school, a Hebrew school, which tended towards Zionism, right? Or a reform school. So there was a whole range of opportunities for what was, in fact, not that huge population, but significant in proportion, in relation to the population of the city as a whole. So this is clearly no longer a communist Jewish school. I believe it's some kind of drop-in center now. Many of the neighborhoods that the Jewish people lived in are now lived in by indigenous people. In other words, there's been a massive urbanization of the indigenous population in Manitoba by Filipinos, which is another large wave of more recent immigration. So here's the Talmud Torah of Winnipeg. It's interesting that the sign is in Yiddish, right? But the language of instruction was largely in Hebrew at this school. So this was the Talmud Torah of my father's generation, probably. He's probably in that picture somewhere. And I went to the Talmud Torah in a new building in the 1960s with the same old teachers in some cases, right? And I can talk about that a little bit, which is, in our case, Yiddish was taught grudgingly, right? Like there were, every now and then, the conductor of the choir, the synagogue choir, would come in and it was time for our Yiddish lesson. And he had a tuning fork with him. Like, you know, he'd go, bing, and people would have to sing. And if you mispronounced a word, he'd hit you on the ear with his tuning fork. But he did that to my father, too. So that's how old he was, and that's the reputation he had. So our Yiddish education in the Talmud Torah was virtually nil. I can read Yiddish, and any Yiddish I know is because of my German and my Hebrew, not because I actually studied Yiddish. And for parents like mine who sent their children to Talmud Torah, Yiddish was considered the language of the past. Right? That it's something they spoke to their own parents. They understood it. They appreciated Jewish humor in Yiddish, but they didn't think it was something we had to learn. Right?
Why did you have lessons at all then?
Pardon me?
You said you had some lessons.
From time to time. I never understood why. Like, when I look back on it, it seems ridiculous to me because it was so unserious that it was almost like a gesture, a grudging gesture.
To the parents or to the...
To somebody, not to my parents. They didn't care if I learned, you know. Later in life, my mother would say to me, "Oh, it's really a shame you didn't learn Yiddish," right? And I'd say, "Yeah, thanks," you know. But in any case, as we talked about the other day, there's a real renewal of interest among younger people for Yiddish, but no thanks to their parents in many cases. That's different. I will just want, you know, for the generation that came to Winnipeg after the war, after the Second World War, the survivors, and many who had been sheltered in the Soviet Union during the war, Yiddish, of course, was still a current language, and their children, my friends, knew it. But for parents like mine, who were second generation, Yiddish was already a thing of the past, and they regarded the parents of my friends with some discomfort. Right? It was like a cultural blip, and they didn't, you know, sometimes they didn't quite know how to deal with it. Right? So this is the Sherazadic today, and you can see, I think the image speaks all you need to know about the social mobility of the Jewish community. So this is an architecturally distinguished building. built in the late 1950s. So in the international style, in a kind of modified Bauhaus style, which says very much about the progress, and it's in the south end of Winnipeg, in the wealthier part of the city. Right? And so that's a good image of how things changed. Now, for the Ukrainians, because you asked me, for example, if there were intersections, and the intersections were constant, because Ukrainians and Jews lived in the same neighborhoods. They were often of similar political persuasions. And so here you have, in the north end of Winnipeg, the Ukrainian Labor Temple. Right? So this was built by pro-communist Ukrainians in the early part of the 20th century. And if you look over the door, right, you can see the crest with the hammer and sickle and workers of the world unite, right? And when I was, again, in Winnipeg, there's a not a folk festival, but a folklore festival, where it happens every August, and each community has a national pavilion, right? And there's the national food, and there's dance, but the Ukrainians always had two. They had Kiev, and they had Lviv, right? And the Lviv pavilion was always in the Ukrainian Labor Temple. And they would import comedians from the Soviet Union, and they would speak English, sort of. And, one would play the piano and the other would tell anti-American jokes, right? But then there was Kiev, and Kiev was the anti-communist, right? Catholic or Orthodox nationalist pavilion that was always in a big high school gymnasium,
Why
right?
was that, why was the Lviv one pro-communist and the Kiev one anti-communist?
It reflected the divisions within the Ukrainian community in Winnipeg. So in the years after the Russian Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a big chapter in Winnipeg of the League of Anti-Bolshevik Nations, which was largely Ukrainian, right? And who supported the white cause, right? And who actively fundraised and supported sort of counter-revolutionary movements. But there was also the labor movement, which was largely communist in its orientation and also quite sizable. So on Main Street in Winnipeg, you've got, so these globe tours would have been seen as a communist front, right? I mean, it's very funny, but people, oh yeah, globe tours, it's not a real travel agency, it's organizing money and support to the Soviet Union, right? But there's whole areas of Winnipeg, like with stores like this. Anne's Pierogi Palace is a big venture. And the church, both Orthodox and Catholic, plays, not just in the past tense, but plays a major role. So this is one of many, many, many Ukrainian churches in the north end of Winnipeg. So when I look up my window here, I feel at home. I could see very similar things at home. Both communities have, it's very interesting. They are rivals and colleagues in the sense that each has their own dance troupe. The Ukrainian community has the Rusalka dancers. The Jewish community has the Chai dancers, right? Both have their own press. Both have their singing stars. And we all went to school together, right? So our friends were, in public school. Once I left the Jewish school, and went to public school, and I was 12 years old. We were all mixed up, right? And so that's kind of, so at the end of the First World War, there's the return of soldiers from Europe, right? Largely of British origin, right? Who decide that immigrants are a problem. Not a new story. And they have these demonstrations at the City Hall of Winnipeg where they identify immigrants with Bolshevism and communism, right? And, say things like deport undesirable aliens. In fact, most of the labor leaders in Winnipeg were British. They came out of a British labor tradition in the early part of the 20th century. But there were a few who were Jewish, but they too came via Britain, right? The immigrant communities were involved in labor action, but they were not the primary leadership of those actions. The most famous is the 1919 general strike, which will celebrate its centenary next year, and there are all kinds of things going on in Winnipeg to mark it. It was the only general strike in North America to be run by a Soviet, right, and called themselves as such. And you know, the Soviets sent off greetings of solidarity to Lenin and to Trotsky for the great accomplishments of the Russian Revolution, right? And this is in 1919. So it was a very polarizing strike, as you might imagine. It was for the usual reasons: shorter hours, more pay, better conditions, recognizing the right to collectively bargain, all of these things that were at the heart of labor demands in the early part of the 20th century. And building businesses that operated had to operate by authority of the strike committee. This went on for about 6 weeks. In the meantime, the people, the business class, supported largely by the middle class, and the police organized against the strike. Here are some marches during the strike. A contingent with a Yiddish banner. Yeah, so there were Jewish workers present in this. Speakers. That could be out of a Soviet film. The famous scene where the city decided to try and run the city's trams without the permission of the strike committee. Right? And so protesters came and turned over the tram car. And this resulted in a charge by mounted police along Main Street that I'd shown you before, which resulted in deaths and which brought the strike to an end. So there were some concessions made, but it's considered an important moment in Winnipeg history because it actually ran against the divisions that were created between so-called, British workers and so-called aliens, right? Because what the strike produced was a kind of convergence. So that today the Winnipeg General Strike is thought of as an important moment in the struggle for workers' rights, but also an important moment in the struggle for an end to discrimination and equal rights. So these are the 4 electoral districts of central Winnipeg. The 2 in the north regularly, throughout the 20th century until the 1960s, they regularly elected communists and social democrats. The ones in the south regularly elected conservatives and liberals. So a very polarized city. A.A. Heaps was an independent labor candidate in the north end of Winnipeg, a Jewish, right? This was his liberal opponent, right? So the liberals advertise in Yiddish, in the Yiddish press, right? And the Liberal Party says, we've done the most for Jews, you should vote for us. Right? Don't vote for the communists, don't vote for the Social Democrats. And now we come to A.M. Klein. So basically what I'm trying to show you is this is the history of the city to which Klein came to speak from Montreal. There are many ties between Montreal and Winnipeg, people going back and forth at this time because Winnipeg was the other important Jewish community. And you might have heard of the Bronfmans. The Bronfmans are a very wealthy family that owned Seagram's Liquor Company. And they have huge foundations. Edgar Bronfman is currently the president of the World Jewish Congress. I believe it's a Charles or Edgar, one of the two.
Seagram's the seltzer water?
Seagram's was rye whiskey. And they also make ginger ale and seltzer. Right. But Seagram's began as a bootlegging operation during American Prohibition. So Seagram's would make alcohol in Canada and secretly transport it across the border into the United States where alcohol was illegal. So they made lots and lots of money. This is how they made their fortune. The Bronfmans did this before Seagram's. Then to give themselves more respectability, they bought Seagram's, which was a Montreal company, and took it over. That's the Seagram's headquarters in Montreal, but there's, in any case. So here we have A.M. Klein, the Social Democratic candidate, where he's going to give a meeting. His book, The Second Scroll, that I told you about. And later in my talk, well, actually, I'll leave this, and I'll leave this up, and I'll show you these slides when we get there. This, do you know what this is? This is Birobidzhan. Okay, so I want to talk about that in a little while. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is shift to more of a formal presentation, because I think what I want to look at is how A.M. Klein's visits to Winnipeg draw out some interesting debates at the time among the Canadian Jewish community, right? And they do this through, and we could see this through his appearances in the Winnipeg Jewish Press and in the talks that he gives. Okay? So the first thing is that to understand is that in the total Jewish population of Winnipeg never exceeded 20,000 people. But 20,000 when the city had a population of 200,000 was in any case quite high, 10% of the city. Right? Today the population is about 13,000 in a city that's about 800,000 people. Yet the Jewish community still continues to play a fairly prominent role. In any case, the first newspaper that was founded in Winnipeg was a Yiddish newspaper, right, called Der Courier, right, the Courier, right, and that was founded in 1910, but it changed its name to Das Yiddische Wort, the Yiddish word, as it were, Das Yiddische Wort in 1917. And the paper remained strictly in Yiddish until 1938, right? And in 1938, which was the year that Klein coincidentally became editor of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, the Yiddische Wort began to publish a few pages in English, right? So there were, as we talked about yesterday, there were realities that had to be faced, right? And both Klein, by deciding to write in English, and the Yiddische Wort, by deciding to start publishing a few of its pages in English, were confronting the reality of the next generation, right? My parents' generation, who had been educated in English and would be using that language. But in the meantime, there were two other Jewish newspapers that were founded in Winnipeg. The Jewish Post in 1925, and the Western Jewish News in 1926. So in a city with only 20,000 Jews, you had three major newspapers, right? And you might ask, how could three papers actually survive in such a small community, right? So a number of historians have tried to answer this question, right? And I'll quote one of them, Anthony Astrakhan. And he says, well, the thing about the Winnipeg community is it was nourished by five traditions: political activism, radicalism, a vital Yiddish culture mixed with a devotion to education, a prairie mystique, in other words, something about being on the plains, right? And a geographic isolation that made Winnipeg the center of its own diaspora. In other words, Winnipeg is not close to anything. And it's a constant source of humor in Winnipeg, that Winnipeg has had a very vital culture because it had to make its own culture. It probably like some Siberian cities, I would imagine. It's the next closest big city to Winnipeg was Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Minneapolis, Minnesota was about 800 or 900 kilometers away. And the next really big city was Chicago, which was even further. So it's not like in the east of Canada where you travel all the time between Montreal and New York and Toronto, and where everything is relatively close, right? And so this culture, this isolation, this geographic isolation, for people who came with strong traditions in education and culture meant that they had to rely on themselves, which they did. As I said before, Klein's exchanges with this community were not primarily literary, even though there was a lively literary culture in Winnipeg. They were actually more on political and humanitarian issues, and those are the ones that I want to concentrate on now. So the first one is indeed the whole debate about Birobidzhan. So can anyone here tell me, do you know anything about Birobidzhan? What do you know?
You know about the project, the Soviet project of migration, Jew migration from Birobidzhan?
Right, okay, so there was a project in the Soviet Union to create an autonomous region for Jews, right? And this region is located very, very far east, right? Pretty close to Mongolia, northern China, right? And it's a project, of course, which didn't really come to fruition, although, and which we see now as a kind of historical oddity. But the thing I discovered when I went through the Winnipeg Jewish press in the 1930s is at the time it was taken very, very seriously. That Zionism, political Zionism, was obviously a major current, right? And the move in favor of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine had its supporters and proponents. But so did settling in Birobidzhan. So the first exchanges that Klein engages in are actually around this question. So in January 1937, the Jewish Post reports on Klein's arrival in Winnipeg, where he's referred to as the assistant executive director of the Zionist organization, not as a great writer, right, but as an organizer. The timing of Klein's visit was almost certainly coincidental, but only a week earlier, the following ad had appeared in the Jewish Post under the banner, "A Greater Promise, Birobidzhan." So this is an ad for a film that was going to be shown in Winnipeg, right around the time Klein got there. So this is the description of the film. A momentous drama of immigrant life in the autonomous Jewish Republic, Birobidzhan, that will thrill people of all races and creeds. Actually produced in Birobidzhan, Russian songs and music that will thrill you. Russian dialogue with English titles, Russia's greatest masterpiece, first Canadian showing direct from Soviet Russia, Regent Theatre, 1 week only. So I thought this is pretty interesting. But what was really interesting for me was where it was being shown, the Regent Theatre, which my grandfather managed. My grandfather, for most of his adult life, managed this movie theater called the Regent. And I used to go there as a child on Saturday afternoons when they had a triple bill of a Western, a monster movie, a Roman gladiator movie, and I got to open the curtain and all the popcorn I wanted. But little did I know that not so many years earlier, this theater was being used to show films from the Soviet Union that promoted Birobidzhan. My grandfather never told me about this. He was not a communist, actually. In fact, he used to tell me about how difficult it was to say no to communist campaigners who would come to his door. But in any case, there it was. So Birobidzhan showed up at the very beginning of my research on Klein, and it showed up at the very end because one of the last articles that Klein wrote for the Winnipeg Jewish Press was called "The Place That Wasn't There." Right? This is an article from 1951, right? And what Klein says in this article is now that the state of Israel has been established, there's really no need for a place that never really existed in the first place. And the Soviet government at this point, after the state of Israel is created with the support of the Soviet Union, we must remember, issued a proclamation and said, well, Jewish people have their homeland in Israel, the project of Birobidzhan is null and void, right? Klein's position was it was actually never real in the first place, but that's fine. But curiously enough, when I went on the web to look at images for Birobidzhan, there you are, that's the train station. It's there today, right? So not only is there a train station with a Yiddish, name, but we have the Happy Chassid, right, or the klezmer musician. And there are other pictures like this. The square is full of these kinds of sculptures. You have synagogues and menorahs.
They have a big like Jewish culture festival every 2 years or so.
Mhm.
Right.
So it's so it's not as if the place has actually disappeared. Far from it. But the idea that this oblast, as it would have been called, right, could serve as an ingathering place for Jews was certainly abandoned. But what's interesting is in Klein's time, this was a real debate, which we have probably forgotten, right? At the time of his 1937 visit, as I said, Klein was the representative of the Zionist movement in competition with the Organization for Jewish Colonization in Russia, known as ICOR, I-C-O-R, and the Canadian Birobidzhan Committee, founded in 1934, the same year that the Soviet government declared it a Jewish oblast. In 1937, more than 25,000 Jews were living there. And as early as 1926, the Winnipeg branch of ICOR had conducted a fundraising campaign to buy tractors for the settlers of Birobidzhan and undertaken to establish 25 families there. So they made a pledge that 25 Jewish families from Winnipeg would move to Birobidzhan in what they called a red aliyah. Right? So you know the term aliyah, right? Move to Israel. This would be a red aliyah to go to Birobidzhan in the Soviet Union. In January 1935, a public meeting in support of Birobidzhan at Winnipeg's Parrott School was such a success that hundreds of people had to be turned away. In other words, whatever existence the Birobidzhan project actually held in 1937, it was certainly more than on paper, right? Even after the Second World War, when Klein returned to Western Canada on behalf of the Canadian Jewish Congress and the United Jewish Relief Agencies, the dream of Birobidzhan had not yet receded into the obscurity it knows today. In November 1945, the Canadian Birobidzhan Committee held a meeting at the Montefiore Club in Montreal. So, the Montefiore Club is a club named after Lord Montefiore and is a private club for well-off Jews, right? And so, even after the Second World War, there were fundraising activities being held for Birobidzhan in places like this, right? Like the headquarters of the Montefiore Club in Montreal. Right. And the campaign that they were running at this point in 1947 was to settle war orphans in Birobidzhan. In 1947, the committee supported the UN resolution, United Nations resolution, calling for the partition of Palestine and the establishment of the Jewish state, thus following not only Soviet foreign policy, but also a logic developed by Chaim Zhitovsky, one of the leading Yiddishist intellectuals of his age. Winnipeg, Henry Srebnick, who's a historian, he tells us that Winnipeg was a Zhitovsky fortress. He visited the city frequently. In the Volksblatt, he wrote, and I quote him, "Our Jewish people now has two countries in which a new Jewish life is being built. A normal life. They ought not to be seen as antagonistic alternatives." Right, so this is 1948, 1949. By the time Clyde returned to the West in 1949, it was the beginning of the end of what Srebnick terms the apogee for the Canadian Jewish communists. We have the Cold War, we have McCarthyism, we have upward mobility. So the heyday of Canadian communists among Jews is coming to an end. If, as Srebnick puts it, the Soviet Union had fathered one state, Birobidzhan, and had been the midwife to the birth of a second one, Israel, by 1949, word was emerging also, and importantly, of the anti-Semitic purges unleashed by Stalin in the Soviet Union, and the related events in the people's democracies of Eastern Europe. Over the next few years, Birobidzhan would be denounced as, quote, largely fraudulent and a failure. All the stories and statistics had been, simply put, mainly fantasy. So Klein's 1951 article, triumphant in tone, were saying, well, the Soviet Union has recognized reality and officially declared the project null and void, is a good example of the saying in English that revenge is a dish best served cold. Now, another area that we can explore thanks to Klein's interventions is the role of the English press in Jewish life. So the Jewish Post, one of the two English publications, regularly published editorials by Klein from the Canadian Jewish Chronicle. It also published, for example, translations into English of Hebrew poems by Chaim Nachman Bialik, right, the Jewish national poet of our generation, as he was called. And this raises an interesting question. If Winnipeg Jewish culture was largely Yiddishist, and Yiddish culture was associated with secularism and political radicalism, what impact did Klein enjoy by appearing in the English press? Who read it? How many people? The prejudice against the English language press should not be underestimated. One historian reports how a woman, her name is Leona Lasker, a Winnipeg educator, and I quote, remembered that the two Anglo-Jewish newspapers were not as respected as the Yiddische Wort, and were often referred to as the local rags. As a researcher of this press in her student years, she concluded that they appealed primarily to the establishment, what were called the WASP Jews. Right? So WASP is an acronym for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So it meant those Jews who were now wealthy and lived in the south end of the city. Right? As a child growing up in Winnipeg, who sat down every evening to a portrait of Isle parrots over her dining room table, Miriam Waddington believed sincerely as a child, and I quote her, that everyone who didn't know Yiddish had assimilated and was doomed and lost to Judaism. I couldn't imagine why the services in the Reformed synagogue were in English, or why anyone needed an Anglo-Jewish press. It seemed to me they were all imitating the English, but like all imitations, they were never as good as the original. So it is true that the Anglo-Jewish papers of Winnipeg did not reflect the radical culture to the same degree as the Yiddish press. But it would be a mistake to see them as complacent rags that spoke only of social teas held by wealthy Jewish housewives, or newly opened summer resorts, or the joys of crossing the border to shop in the United States, even though these papers did all of those things. When I looked through the English Jewish press at this time, it was clear the study circles of the Arbeiter Ring, visits by cultural figures from the Soviet Union, literary events associated with Bundists and left-wing Zionists were all routinely advertised and reported on. The three holiday supplements of the Jewish Post, at Rosh Hashanah, Chanukah, and Pesach, approached each some 200 pages and contained long essays by leading Jewish intellectuals on the period, on topics philosophical, literary, and political. So, in other words, the caricature that was made of the Anglo-Jewish press by the Yiddish press really wasn't a justified one. It actually tried to encompass most of what was happening. In the early 1930s and 40s, the papers regularly included eyewitness, usually anonymous accounts of life in Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe, especially of the persecution of Jews. The Post, for example, published Thomas Mann's anti-Nazi polemics, the German novelist who exiled himself, right? And in the same 1937 issue, where I found the ad for the film about Birobidzhan, there was a front page article on the Civil War in Spain that took a decidedly Republican orientation. Right? The other lead story on that front page, besides the Birobidzhan ad, the Spanish Civil War, was Palestine Arabs yielding on boycott of Royal Commission. right? So this is in the 30s when the British government is holding various commissions to talk about the partition of Palestine. In other words, this front page can tell us much about the orientation of the Anglo-Jewish press, at least until the end of the Second World War and the establishment of the State of Israel. It was interested in questions of democracy and fascism, pro-Zionist, and supraclass in its defense of Jewish issues, themselves regarded as part of a larger struggle for social justice. In these respects, Klein's political interventions fit well enough into the English Jewish press of Winnipeg. The Post's own political views aligned with Klein's in 1935 when, along with the Yiddish Avort, it endorsed the candidate A. Heaps, whose photo I showed you before. The Yiddish Avort routinely endorsed left-wing candidates, but the Jewish Post usually shrank away from endorsing anybody and from what they called Jewish class voting. In other words, they did not suggest that Jews vote as a group for any one candidate. But the attraction of the Social Democrats on Jewish intellectuals in Montreal and Winnipeg is worth dwelling on because it puts some balance into the idea that all Jewish intellectuals were supporters of the communists, which was actually not the case. As one historian observed, immigrants to Canada from many states carried the Social Democratic banner, with those from Britain having pride of place. But among those Social Democratic immigrants from Britain were Jews, some of whom played a prominent role in the 1919 strike. The Communist Party membership was largely Jewish and Ukrainian, but the Communist Party would not run Jews or Ukrainians, for the most part, as candidates, right? Because they didn't want to, they were afraid that if they ran Ukrainians or Jews as candidates, they would be accused of being in the service of a foreign ideology. So even though most of their membership was Ukrainian and Jews, they always found British-descended people to run as candidates. Whereas the Social Democrats, who were founded by a Methodist minister in Canada and British in orientation, routinely ran Jewish candidates, like A.M. Klein and A.A. Heaps. Right? The last area that I think is interesting to explore is Klein and the future of Jewish culture. And I'll go quickly here. I talked about this the other day. Klein was a little bit skeptical about the development of the Jewish community in North America. He wrote an article called American Jewry Practice 1 out of 613 mitzvot. Right, as you might know, there are 613 mitzvot that a Jew is obligated to carry out. He says Americans only do one of them. Do you know which one that is? Charity. Tzedakah. And it's true, the Jewish community in North America gives enormous amounts of money to causes both Jewish and non-Jewish, right? According to the Post, and I quoted, while touring the West, Mr. Klein took time out to deliver some clever barbed shafts, at the shallowness of mass Jewish culture. Noting that most of Klein's own contributions to Jewish culture are in English, the Post reported that the poet asserted that our view of Jewish culture must be broadened to include many languages besides Hebrew and Yiddish, and he referred to Maimonides' great works in Arabic as precedents. Work devoted to broad human values, above and beyond sectarian Jewish themes, are also Jewish achievements, he said. Now, the reference to Hebrew and not just Yiddish is telling, because Klein was not impressed either with the quality of contemporary Israeli literature. He didn't appreciate what he called the tendency in Israel to write off diaspora Jewry as a lost cause. And I quote him, "The destruction of the galut, the diaspora, preached in Israel must be combated, not least of all because Israel in these early years, and I quote, cannot spare time for cultural refinement and the literary wider horizons that come only with stability and the close of the frontier era." Klein was a committed Zionist, but he continued to insist upon a dynamic life for diaspora Jewry, a cultural, intellectual, and political life in dialogue with the broader community. In the interview, he discussed his work on Joyce's Ulysses. The Post reports how he enthusiastically described his affinity for Joyce's technique because they emulated the intellectual brilliance and playful delight in legalistic pranks and wiles found in so much of Jewish halachic literature. Also, Klein traced his interest in Ulysses and his penchant for French poetry to early exposure to Catholic influences in his native Quebec. I quoting him, "After all, the Talmudic system and the Jesuitical system are just reverse sides of the same coin." So I'm going to end there because we want some time for questions. But as I said, Klein was not primarily received as a literary personage in Western Canada. After his death, he received very praiseworthy obituaries in the press. It's too bad he never got that literary attention when he was alive, even though he got it a lot in other places, in Montreal and New York and elsewhere. But his presence in Winnipeg, in other words, I used Klein as a kind of divining rod, if you like, for finding social attitudes towards a number of questions as the Jewish community in Western Canada moved from one of immigration and fundamentally proletarian in organization to a middle class and upper middle class community. And so the patterns are similar to Montreal, but in some ways different. Huh? The move away from orthodoxy is much more pronounced in Winnipeg. The interactions with other ethnic communities from the same parts of the world are much more pronounced in Winnipeg. And the kinds of relations of rivalry, collaboration that I talked about when I first answered your question are much more present even today. And I would say not communist traditions, but left-wing social democratic traditions are much more prevalent and long-lasting in a city like Winnipeg than they are in the Jewish community of Montreal. So that's where I'll stop.